Good morning. This conference blends two kinds of conversations. One's about what special perspectives Christians can bring to given public policy issues. The other's simply about what kinds of public policy issues Christians should care about. Michael tells me that our conversation this morning belongs more in the second category. And since he's the boss, I'll try to abide by his wishes. And certainly agree that Christians should care about child hunger and child poverty. But I also invite our panel to speak a bit to the first issue if they see fit. We have two members of the clergy on our panel, Eugene and Pamela, and Anne tells me that she survived 12 years of Catholic school, so I think she qualifies as well. Very briefly, some context. Most of you may know this, but in case you're new to the issue of poverty, the past few years have been a remarkable time. When the pandemic broke out in the spring of 2020, the conventional wisdom, or maybe even the universal wisdom, was that poverty rates would soar. But instead, over the subsequent year, we saw an unprecedented expansion of government aid, including increased SNAP, expanded school meals, and in essence, a guaranteed income for children, for families with children through an expanded child tax credit. As a result, child poverty in 2021 fell to its lowest level on record. That aid has now expired, and poverty is essentially returned to pre-pandemic, or in the case of hunger, even worse levels. Where does that leave us? I guess an optimist could say that having been through the experience of cutting child poverty in half, we've seen the potency and the potential of government action. Progressives often say that poverty is a policy choice, not a fate, and if government could cut it in half, it can do so again. Of course, I'm a journalist, not an optimist. A pessimist might point to the political backlash against that aid, and especially the current determination among conservative Republicans who control the House of Representatives to make deep cuts to government spending. With that, our distinguished panel will try to address what comes next, where we go from here. We're going to start with Anne Filipic. She's the CEO of Share Our Strength. Then we'll move to Pamela Irvine, the president and CEO of Feeding Southwest Virginia, and Eugene Cho, president and CEO of Bread for the World. Anne.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a real treat to be here with all of you. I'd love to start with just talking about what drew me to work on this issue. So I started at Share Our Strength a little over a year ago. I came from the White House, had also served in the Obama White House, and have worked on a wide range of issues. This is actually my first time working on hunger. And what really drew me to this issue is first that childhood hunger, hunger generally, but our focus at Share Our Strength is childhood hunger, is a crisis in this country. 1 in 5 children in this country are food insecure. And it is a solvable crisis. And I came up through an organizing background, and so I really like working on issues that I feel like are solvable, that we can wrap our arms around and have a true impact on. And this is not, obviously, based on what I just said, 1 in 5 children are food insecure. This is not a small issue. This is a huge issue. And the way that I think about the work, yes, I am deeply passionate about making sure that all our children have full bellies, but I think about it more broadly. I think about it as ensuring that all our children have the opportunity to reach their full potential. And I am the mom of 3 young kids, 7, 3.5, and 1.5. And every night, as I, sort of brush off the chaos from the day, the last thing that I'm thinking about before I'm going to bed is, have I done everything today to make sure that my kids have what they need to reach their full potential? And I believe that is ultimately the question that we face as a society. Have we provided that opportunity for all of our children? And I'd say choose an issue that you are passionate about. And imagine we live in a world where all children reach their full potential, and I guarantee you that issue would look very different today. So I see both the solvable nature of this problem and the bigness of it, and that really excites me and makes me committed to this cause. So this also brings us to the question, which I think Jason teed up beautifully, of if this is a solvable problem, what is preventing us from solving it? Why have we not only not solved it, but to be honest, are not on the cusp of solving it? And I think of this in many ways, and this leads me to the work of Share Our Strength, of the work is about disrupting the status quo. The status quo is a very powerful thing in terms of how we think about what we accept as a society and how we think about what's possible as we dream for a brighter future, envision a world where all children and families have what they need to thrive. So we're really, at Share Our Strength, in the business of disrupting the status quo. And I'll give you a couple examples. First, we've spent a lot of effort on school meals. Breakfast, as an example. Traditionally, and this makes perfect logical sense, breakfast was being served in cafeterias. We probably all say that makes a ton of sense. But what that meant in practice was that for any child to get breakfast, they had to show up to school early, they didn't go to their classroom, and what that ended up meaning is that fewer than half of kids who were eligible for breakfast, school meals in this country, were getting breakfast, participating in the program. So we, over the last decade at Share Our Strength, have worked in partnership with schools, the state and federal government, community-based, faith-based organizations to institute breakfast in the classroom. A very simple concept, but that means that kids can be actually having breakfast in their first period at school. A lot of logistical barriers, but completely surmountable barriers. That is a small thing, but just how disrupting the status quo, those changes that we made meant that pre-pandemic, an additional 3 million children across the country were getting breakfast. And back to my point about this is more than just a full belly, think about what that means for what they're able to accomplish in their full day, in their school day, when they start the day with a full stomach. The other thing I will say, and that leads me also to a huge opportunity I think we have when I think about disrupting the status quo, is summer meals. So for the majority of kids that count on school meals, we often think about summer as this easy breezy time. For a lot of kids and families, food is a huge issue for them. They are not getting the school meals. We have, through the government, a summer meal program that has existed for many years, but it has not worked, and Pamela lives the front line of this, so she can speak to it more compellingly than I can. But a fraction of the children who have been eligible for this program have benefited from it because it required a congregate setting. It required that you go gather in person to get that meal. Well, if their parents are working, who's taking them to get that meal? If they live in a rural setting and have to drive 20 miles to get that meal, they're likely not participating in it. And thankfully, in terms of disrupting the status quo, last December, Congress passed $29 billion in the omnibus about really transforming how this government program, this summer meals program, is implemented. And we collectively have a huge opportunity now to bring that forward, to work in partnership with the government. The changes include that it no longer is that congregate setting required, and also that there's summer EBT, essentially almost like little debit cards that you're given that families can go shop at grocery stores to get food that they need as well. So this is one example of disrupting the status quo. How do we accept that the status quo is an acceptable way for our government programs to run? And then, after we've successfully advocated for change, how do we work together to implement those changes? And when it comes to summer meals, we are living that exact opportunity, and I think a great thing for the faith-based community to rally around. I could say a lot more, but I will leave it at that and pass it on to Pamela.
Good morning. I think about what kept me in this work for 42 years. And I think about the fact that I was an individual with experience in food insecurity, and that drew me to the work. But really what has kept me in this work has been the power of influence and seeing how that we can change lives, not just through our feeding programs, but also through policy changes and empowering people to have a voice and an opportunity to influence the circumstances in their own life. And as we talked about earlier, children, there was a USDA report just come out that's very sad. 44 million individuals in this country is food insecure. 13 million are children. And for me, my opinion is that is socially, politically, and spiritually wrong. We have so many people that are struggling to put food on their table, and there's so many ways that we can work together collaboratively, and we did see that during the pandemic. One of the things that we saw in our communities, and by the way, we serve 26 counties in Southwest Virginia, a couple hours down 81, and so 27 counties in that area, the food insecurity rate is higher than the state average of 8.8%, and one of our counties is 28%. So early on in our industry and in the work that I've done over the years, I looked for partners, collaborative partners, and one of the best illustrations came out of the pandemic. And you have to look for the good in every situation. And we know that was probably one of the most challenging times in my history, in my life. However, what came out of that was generosity. What came out of that was the government and elected officials, community organizations, national organizations started working together, trying to figure out how we could change the model, how we could do things differently. And overnight, we all developed these programs and these wonderful relationships that I believe that are going to take us to the next generation of service-oriented organizations. I believe, and I've worked with all of our elected officials from our national to our state to our local city council members and board of supervisors. And I can tell you one thing that I believe, it's about the relationship. If you develop the relationship and you keep that relationship, you may disagree, and I have many times with my elected officials. However, we've always respected one another. We shared what our need was. We talked about what the issues are, and then we moved on to the solution. And I believe faith-based organizations have a wonderful opportunity right now. Coming out of the pandemic, many of our faith organizations started showing up, figuring out how to feed people when they've never fed people before. And then we have our elected officials who I believe learned that there's something to be learned by the fact that we can all together, we can solve problems in communities. And so as we begin to work on our next chapter of ask for our congressional members, it's going to be the Farm Bill. And we're going to talk about SNAP and WIC and the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program, where our food bank gets 30% of its food supply. It's taken everyone from national to state to local partners, organizations, faith-based churches, and organizations that feed people that are on the front lines every day. And I'll tell you the truth. I've seen some of the oldest people that I've worked with now for 42 years, and I believe it's the fountain of youth. When you pour yourself out into someone else, it keeps you young, it keeps you spirited, and it gives you a sense of accomplishment in a way that you couldn't do it any other way. So I've enjoyed the journey. I'm still there, hope to be there a couple more years, and still passionate about working the Hill up here in D.C. and in Richmond and in the courthouse and the city halls in our communities. We can all work together and solve this problem.
Thank you. Wow. I feel like we should pass an offering basket for you. That was so impassionate. Yes, thank you so much. Anne and Pamela have shared so much helpful insight, thoughts, statistics. I thought I might maybe approach this from a different perspective in the limited time that I have. I was a local church pastor for about 30 years. And the reason why I came to this work as the president at Bread for the World primarily is because of my faith. When people ask me the question, how do you think or why do you think people of faith and Christians should be involved in this work, I often respectfully push back and say, how can we not? I don't think it's an option. It's not a tertiary issue for us as people of faith. Solutions, we know we can debate that and have robust conversations, but we should never be shy and timid about the why. It is part of our identity and part of our worship. So faith is one, but connected to faith, I would say, is our theology of flourishing. And for those that might not be familiar with that, but it is a concept that is growing more and more, I think, foundational to our worldview. We believe that as people of faith, regardless, whatever your background might be, every single human being created in the image of God deserves and that God desires for us to experience human flourishing. And one of the foundational ways that's possible is through food and nutrition. You cannot experience flourishing and health and wellness, and in a country that regularly boasts itself as the greatest nation on the face of this world, this sort of exceptionalism that we Americans are often known for, it is nonsensical. It's kind of crazy to think about the recent statistic that 13 million of our younger friends here in this country experience some level of food insecurity. So solutions are important. I think it really begins with a sort of a holy outrage that it shouldn't be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. The last thing that I'll just share before passing it off back to Jason here is the importance of proximity. As a local church pastor, it's one of the big adjustments that I've made coming to the DC world. I thought elder board meetings were tough. Now I've realized that, wow, things here in DC can also be challenging. But I think one of the biggest hurdle is the issue of proximity. If we're not careful, it ends up becoming statistics and talking points, and it becomes issues. And I'm all for the importance of wonky conversations. But if we lose our proximity with women and men and children, both here in our nation and also around the world, where we're right now facing the worst global hunger crisis in the last 50 years. And so I'll just share one story with you. Many years ago, my wife and I, we had started a church in Seattle. Things didn't quite turn out the way that we had envisioned on our Excel sheet. And next thing you know, I was unemployed. Found out that a Master's of Divinity degree was useless to society. Nobody would hire me, and I was unemployed for about a year. It was really, really hard. And it was the first time we had to navigate certain systems that I had no idea about. And so learned to connect with a social worker, went into our Washington DSHS program. Long story short, we eventually ended up qualifying for an important safety net program called Women, Infant, and Children, WIC, which was referenced earlier. And I look back now, and I'm not quite sure where we would have been had it not been for that safety net program. Fast forward a few years, I was struggling, just to be very honest and transparent, with the stigma of having to utilize programs. It was not something that I think, in my mind, my parents would have been proud of, on and on and on. And I remember a few years after that season of my life, I decided to share about that experience as a pastor in a sermon. And what stunned me was, as a pastor that prided myself in knowing the pulse and the heartbeat of my congregation, when I shared that story, I was stunned at the number of people that reached out to me, not just after that sermon, but throughout the next few weeks, basically in essence saying, me too. We're going through this right now. We're hungry right now. And so I want to just share with you, we're not just talking about 13 random million children. We're actually talking about people in our neighborhoods, in our pews. And so we're asking for the importance of how do we advocate and seek for solutions for the flourishing, not just of those children or their children, but really for all of our children and for Americans and people around the world. Jason, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Let me pick up where you left off in making this not just abstract about issues. The Farm Bill's coming up. It's very important to feeding programs. I'm interested in hearing you all talk about why it's important, but I'm also interested in hearing your response to people on the other side of the political divide. The Speaker of the House has expressed deep concerns about SNAP. He's an avowed Christian. He views it as a bloated welfare program. He says we need to make it a life vest, not a way of life. His words, hand up, not hand out. How do you Pamela, you maybe start with you. You talked about speaking across political divides. There are significant numbers of fellow Christians who feel that way about government aid. How do you address that? Why don't we start with Pamela and then Ann and Eugene.
As we have worked with very conservative members of the House over the years, I've learned that our job is to ask. Our job is to provide an opportunity for those individuals to talk to individuals, our neighbors who are challenged, to put food on their table. And I've also found that to be truthful. And, you know, their job is to react how they're going to react. But our job is to always ask, to always push, not just to represent the individuals that we support and that we feed, but to bring those individuals face to face with the representatives. So I believe one of the most powerful ways that we can work through this is to constantly have those individuals, like your experience and my experience, to sit across from the individuals that have the influence of vote and policy, and let them share their story, their constituents. And I believe there's a way that we can mobilize, and I know Feeding America's been working on this, mobilizing our neighbors to share their experience, because they're constituents, they're voters, and our opportunity is to increase the votes.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Eugene was saying in his opening remarks about this being a proximate issue and how easy it is for all of us to fall into a place where we other those that are benefiting from these programs. And certainly I think that's true of our elected officials as well. So just as Pamela said, I think, how do we bring these stories to life? So much of effective organizing is storytelling, right? And to really center the stories, the humanity. And I also do believe, and I'm not naive about this, as you said, Jason, there's been an extraordinary backlash to the pandemic era spending, which did lower poverty levels, historic levels in this country. And we have seen that now that the pandemic era policies have expired, we see us back to a place, and actually worse than we were pre-pandemic, now with 1 in 5 children hungry. We're at 1 in 7 in 2019. So I do think that we have to be careful in how we sort of leverage that story, because many are very up in arms about the spending that we did. But I do think that there are opportunities to lift up stories of how transformative that was for individuals and how it changed the trajectory of their lives and their families' lives. And I think the more that we, maybe in the face of that skepticism, lift up stories of success and the ongoing, even as those programs have ended, that for some, that those benefits in terms of what it has meant for their family and the trajectory that it put them on continues forward. So I do think there's a huge part of this that is a storytelling and sort of lifting up the individuals and honoring the complexity of the experiences when it's so easy to fall into a place of, as I said, sort of othering individuals who depend on these programs.
To the speaker, to other folks on Congress that may have a more conservative view on these issues, I'm really grateful for these voices. I'm grateful for their pushback. I'm grateful for their involvement in leadership, because I think as a nation, we need people representing different points of views. Now, having said that, I think there's an elephant in the room, and one of the elephants in the room is this crisis of the debt here in this nation. And I think it's an important conversation that our leaders and our nation has to tackle and discuss. My concern has always been, why is it that sometimes social services and those programs impacting our neighbors who are struggling with hunger and poverty, it feels as if sometimes these issues are oftentimes the first thing on the chopping block. That would be the first thing. The second thing is, if there is a criticism that these programs aren't perfect, they're right. It's not 100% perfect. But what we know through research is that there are these myths that are myths. They're not accurate. And I fear that oftentimes, whether it's constituents or members of Congress, during a time of misinformation or disinformation, we're basing certain policies or inclinations based upon half-truths or myths. So for example, the idea that people are not working, that is a myth. The idea that there's a huge percentage of people that are abusing these programs, these are also myths as well. I don't have the exact specific percentage, but it is very, very small. And on the most part, it is some of the most effective programs to ensure, again, our neighbors having not an agreement or a absolute path towards flourishing, but an opportunity for flourishing. And this is essential not just for the here, but also for the future as well.
Michael made a point to me that I hadn't thought about before and struck me as important and right, which is that the hunger issue sort of blurs the distinction between government aid and private aid. That it's a lot of it's, of course, funded by the government, but it's distributed in many cases by Christian organizations and by private groups. Would you all say something about the way in which hunger programs blur that political distinction and make it not a one or either or, government versus private sector? Pamela, you're nodding. You want to go ahead? I think maybe we're getting towards the end of our time, so why don't we end with that?
Okay. So, you know, we always hear it takes a community to feed a community. In my opinion and in my experience in 42 years, it takes a nation to feed a community. And it takes us all, private, public, government, faith-based, charities, individuals. It takes us all to feed children and individuals in our communities.
Well, say a bit more. Where does the food come from and who gives it out?
The food comes from private donations, the food comes from the government, the food comes from corporations and food drives, individuals, but it also is distributed through faith-based partners and other feeding programs that are not faith-based. And so that combination, private-public partnership, is extremely important in order for us to be able to get enough food to move it through our system and to not just flourish and nourish, but also to transform people's lives by providing hope through food.
And if I can just add to this, as I've worked on a number of different issues and think about what is sort of some of the most powerful roles that nonprofits can play in the space, and I do think the sort of government proximate work that's to be done and to understand how we can help leverage the extraordinary resources that the government puts into these programs that, as I was saying, sometimes are not reaching the intended audience, are not sort of living the full potential of what these programs can be, because sometimes of sort of small bureaucratic or administrative issues that sort of prevent us from, as I said, fulfilling the full potential. So I think some of the opportunity with nonprofit organizations is to work in community in a way that the government is not generally set up to do in the same way, in community, in partnership, understanding in reality what are the barriers that prevent us from leveraging these resources and working in partnership to address it. And I will say, to go back to summer, that we have an extraordinary opportunity in front of us, and I think the Summer Meals Program is a perfect example of how this all comes together. $29 billion in funding from Congress, and so there is funding that's going out, but the work of actually implementing, delivering these summer meals happens at the local level with school organizations, with community-based organizations, and with faith-based organizations. And actually, we have a moment in front of us where this amazing legislation was passed, but the question to us is, can we work in partnership to leverage the opportunity? And that was what, my work working on the Affordable Care Act, how I thought about what it was all about, and that's a moment that we face on the hunger issue right now. So I think there is an extraordinary, it's not an either or, it is all of us together, as you said, Pamela, and I think understanding specifically what the nonprofit or faith-based community is really good at doing, and how that can fill a gap of things that maybe the government isn't really good at doing, and how it all comes together to make this a more seamless experience for the people that depend on it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think that was a good panel. I've been writing about these issues for decades, and I learned a lot. So thank you, Ann. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Eugene.